Attached, you find this very simple application, which in the end currently just has this app component with a div and a h1 tag. So essentially what you just saw on the slide here. And now let's replicate that behavior I showed you on the slide. Let's say for some reason, eventually a paragraph should be added here. Now, how can we eventually add this and not add it right from the start? Well, with a state change, for example. We could have some state which changes such that initially no paragraph is rendered, but then at some point, because a button was clicked or a timer expired or anything else happened, the paragraph is displayed. Now I will work with a button here, and therefore first of all I will import use state, of course, because we need some state, because as I mentioned, React will only rerun this function and reevaluate what's on the screen if state, props, or context changes. Now, since this is our root component, props and context is a bit harder, and in the end it's also worth noting that of course it all comes down to state changes ultimately. Even context internally will use some state that might change the value which is then distributed through context. And if we think about props being passed from a parent to a child, how could the value passed through props change? Well, ultimately, only if state in a parent changed. It all comes down to state changes in the end if you think about it. So therefore here we're going to work with some state, and I'll name my state here show paragraph and set show paragraph. And initially that is false. My initial state here is false. And then here we use show paragraph as you learned it in the conditional module, in the conditionals module. This is how we can show a element conditionally. Now, if I save this, of course we will not see the paragraph because our state is false, and currently we have no way of changing that state. Now, in the starting project, you find a button component, just so that we have a nicely styled button. So I will add this button component here, import button from /components UI button. Show paragraph is the label we could have on it. And then here we can add the onClick prop on the button and add a function here, toggle paragraph handler, for example. And this function should trigger when the button is clicked. And it should actually toggle the paragraph, let's say. So I'll rename my caption here to toggle paragraph. And in there, I will then set show paragraph, and I will set the state to what show paragraph currently is not, so that we basically inverse it. The short form would be this syntax, where we set the value for show paragraph to the opposite of the old value. But since we depend on the previous state snapshot, I mentioned that we want to use the function form for the state update here. I will come back to why we do that later in this module again, by the way. And therefore, let's use the function form, previous show paragraph, and we'd return the opposite of previous show paragraph, therefore. And this is the cleaner way of changing our state. And now we bind the toggle paragraph handler to the button. So with that, we have the logic to conditionally show the paragraph. Now to center this, I'll quickly go into my styles here and add text align center here in the app selector. Side note, I'm not using CSS modules here, I'm just using regular CSS imports. Okay, with that, let's click toggle paragraph. And you see the paragraph is here, and it's gone, and it's here, and so on. Now that's interesting to know. But let's now analyze what's happening. First of all, I always mentioned that state changes, prop changes, and context changes would result in this component function being executed again. If that's the case, we should be able to add a console log here and say app running and see this whenever we click the button in the end. Well, let's see whether that's the case. I'll save that. Here's my console, and you see initially app running. That is because the page reloaded and that brought this app component to the screen for the first time. So of course this was executed by React. And for that first render cycle, React then found out that it wants a div, a h1 element, and a button, no paragraph, because initially that's not shown. And it checks that to the last output it saved. And since this rendered the component for the first time, there essentially is no previous output, there is no previous snapshot, and therefore this difference comparison in the end resulted in a div, a h1 tag, and a button to be rendered. And that information was handed off to the React DOM package, which therefore rendered that to the screen. Now if I click toggle paragraph, we see app running again. So that proves my point that for every state change, the entire component in which the state changed is re-executed, is re-evaluated. Now, how is the real DOM affected though? For that, let's go to the Elements tab in the DevTools, and let's expand our div here, the app div. Now, if I reload, we see we just have the h1 and the button element here initially. And now, the good thing about this Elements tab is that things that are changed in the DOM will be flashed. They will be highlighted so that we can see where the real DOM was re-rendered or updated. Now therefore watch this part on the right here as I click the toggle paragraph button. You see, the only thing that flashed was this paragraph. The h1 and the button element did not flash, neither did anything else. It was just a paragraph. And if I remove it, it's just a div, because from there the paragraph was removed. But the h1 and the button elements were not flashed because they were not re-rendered. And that's what I meant. Only the difference between those virtual snapshots was considered for the updates made to the real DOM. And that is really, really crucial to understand. Now let's see how that might change if we work with more components.